when ruthless bullies steal their quiet new teacher's car keys as a cruel prank. They have no idea she's a Wing Chun master with lightning-fast reflexes and a mysterious past that could shatter their world. What starts as teenage cruelty becomes an unforgettable lesson in respect, redemption, and the true meaning of strength. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the sprawling campus of Riverside Academy like a protective shroud, its tendrils weaving through the towering oak trees that had stood sentinel over the prestigious private school for nearly a century. Located in the affluent suburb of Millbrook Heights, Connecticut, the academy was a fortress of red brick and ivy-covered walls where the children of politicians, CEOs, and old money families learned not just academics, but the subtle art of wielding influence. Sarah Chun pulled her modest Honda Civic into the faculty parking lot, her grip steady on the steering wheel despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. At 29, she possessed an understated elegance that seemed almost fragile in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the school's main building. Her shoulder-length black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her navy blazer and khaki slacks spoke of someone trying to blend into the background rather than command attention. This was her third day at Riverside Academy, and already she could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following her through the polished corridors. The previous English teacher had left abruptly mid-semester under mysterious circumstances, leaving Sarah to step into a classroom full of entitled teenagers who viewed her arrival as either an inconvenience or an opportunity for entertainment. Sarah gathered her leather satchel and a stack of freshly printed lesson plans, taking a moment to center herself before facing another day. The crisp October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of field hockey practice, reminders of the privileged world she now inhabited. She had chosen Riverside Academy carefully, drawn by its reputation for academic excellence, and its location far from the bustling cities where her past might catch up with her. As she walked toward the imposing entrance, Sarah's footsteps echoed softly on the pristine pathway. Students in their crisp uniforms moved in clusters, their conversations punctuated by laughter that seemed to carry an edge of cruelty. She had learned to recognize the social hierarchies that governed places like this, the invisible lines that separated the powerful from the powerless, the hunters from the hunted. Inside the building, the marble floors gleamed under chandeliers that had witnessed decades of teenage drama. Sarah made her way to the faculty lounge, a sanctuary of coffee-stained carpets and mismatched furniture that stood in stark contrast to the opulence of the student areas. A few teachers looked up from their morning routines, offering polite nods that didn't quite reach their eyes. She was still the outsider here, the unknown quantity who hadn't yet proven herself worthy of their inner circle. Her first class of the day was Advanced Placement Literature with the senior class, 18. Students who represented the cream of Riverside Academy's academic crop. As Sarah arranged her materials at the front of the classroom, she became aware of three figures in the back row who seemed to radiate a different kind of energy than their peers. Marcus Hartwell sat like a king surveying his domain, his perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light streaming through the tall windows. The son of a Supreme Court justice, he possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having to question his place in the world. His blazer was tailored to perfection, his school tie knotted with the precision of someone who understood that appearances mattered as much as actions. To his left lounged Brooklyn Sinclair, her strawberry blonde hair cascading over one shoulder in carefully orchestrated waves. The daughter of a media mogul, she had inherited her father's instinct for finding and exploiting weakness. Her uniform was regulation compliant, yet somehow managed to suggest rebellion, each modification subtle enough to avoid official reprimand while making her intentions clear. The third member of their trinity was Cameron Rodriguez, whose dark eyes missed nothing, and whose smile never quite reached the corners of his mouth. His father owned half the commercial real estate in the tri-state area, and Cameron had learned early that information was currency and secrets were weapons. Where Marcus commanded through presence and Brooklyn through charm, Cameron operated through calculation. Together, they formed an apex predator pack that had terrorized Riverside Academy's social ecosystem for years. Teachers feared them, not because of their academic prowess, though all three maintained impeccable grades, but because of their ability to make life miserable for anyone who crossed them. Phone calls from powerful parents, strategic social media campaigns, and carefully orchestrated public humiliations were just a few tools in their arsenal. As Sarah began her lesson on contemporary American poetry, she noticed the trio's attention wasn't on her words, but on her reactions. They were studying her like scientists observing a specimen, testing her responses to small disruptions, a whispered comment here, a deliberately dropped book there, nothing overt enough to warrant discipline, but enough to establish the dynamic they wanted. During the discussion of Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, Sarah posed a question about resilience in the face of adversity. The irony wasn't lost on her as she watched Marcus exchange a meaningful glance with his companions. She had spent years studying resilience, not in literature but in life, learning to bend without breaking and to find strength in stillness. Miss Chun, Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Do you think some people invite adversity through their own weakness? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah recognized it for what it was, a probe, a test of her boundaries. Around the room, other students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with poetry, I think, Sarah replied carefully, her voice maintaining its gentle cadence. That adversity often reveals character rather than creating it. Sometimes what appears to be weakness is simply wisdom choosing its battles. Brooklyn's laugh was musical but sharp, like crystal breaking. How philosophical. But in the real world, don't you think perception becomes reality? If people see weakness, doesn't that make it true? Sarah's hands remained steady as she continued writing on the whiteboard, though something flickered in her dark eyes, a shadow of memory, perhaps, or recognition of a game she had played before in different circumstances. Perception can be deceiving, she said simply. Still waters often run deeper than we imagine. The class continued without further incident, but as students filed out for their next period, Sarah noticed the trio lingering near the doorway. They weren't talking, just observing, and she felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated by predators, deciding whether she was worth their attention. During lunch, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, grading papers and trying to ignore the way her hands wanted to move through forms she hadn't practiced in months. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath layers of careful restraint and deliberate normalcy. Her previous life felt like a dream sometimes, the late-night training sessions in Chinatown dojos, the whispered respect of masters who had recognized something special in her dedication to Wing Chun, the way her body had learned to flow like water and strike like lightning. That life had ended in Hong Kong, in a moment of perfect technique that had nearly destroyed everything she believed about herself. The memory lived in her hands still, the sensation of connecting with devastating precision, the sound of impact that had echoed through her nightmares for 2 years. She had walked away from everything after that, the tournaments, the teaching opportunities, the community that had become her family, because she had learned that true power lay not in the ability to fight, but in choosing not to. The afternoon brought her final class of the day, Introduction to Creative Writing with Juniors. The energy was different here, less intense but somehow more volatile. These were students still discovering their identities, still testing boundaries and pushing limits. Sarah had just begun explaining their next assignment when the fire alarm pierced the afternoon quiet. As students filed out according to emergency procedures, Sarah gathered her purse and keys, following the crowd toward the designated assembly area on the main lawn. The October air was crisp against her face as she stood with her fellow faculty members, watching hundreds of students cluster in their assigned groups while administrators counted heads and consulted clipboards. The all-clear came 30 minutes. Later, a malfunction in the science wing, nothing serious. But as Sarah made her way back toward the faculty parking lot, her hand instinctively reached into her purse for her car keys. Her fingers found her wallet, her phone, her reading glasses, but the familiar weight of her key ring was conspicuously absent. She stopped walking, her breath visible in the cooling air as she methodically searched through her purse again. Nothing. A cold knot formed in her stomach as she retraced her steps, checking the ground around her assigned parking space, looking under nearby cars, even returning to her classroom to search her desk drawers. The keys were simply gone. As the parking lot emptied and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sarah found herself standing beside her locked Honda Civic with a growing sense of unease. She had been careful about her keys and had felt their reassuring weight in her purse during the evacuation. Somewhere between the classroom and the parking lot, they had vanished. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and she found herself facing Marcus, Brooklyn, and Cameron. They moved with the casual confidence of people who belonged everywhere they went, their uniforms still immaculate despite the day's disruptions. "Having trouble, Miss Chun?" Marcus asked, his tone perfectly polite and somehow deeply unsettling. Sarah studied their faces, noting the way Brooklyn's eyes sparkled with barely contained amusement, how Cameron's expression remained neutral while his gaze catalogued her every reaction. "I seem to have misplaced my keys," she said evenly. "That's terrible," Brooklyn said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Keys have a way of turning up in the strangest places, don't they?" The trio exchanged glances loaded with meaning, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, not anger exactly, but a recognition of familiar territory. She had encountered predators before and had learned to read the subtle signs of orchestrated cruelty. These three hadn't simply found her keys. They had taken them, and now they were savoring her helplessness like wine. "I suppose I'll need to call a locksmith," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the racing of her heart. Cameron stepped forward slightly, his smile never wavering. "Actually, Miss Chun, we might be able to help you with that. But first, maybe we should talk about expectations. You know, what it means to fit in at a place like Riverside Academy." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in the kind of plausible deniability that powerful families taught their children from birth. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, seeing not just teenage bullies, but the adults they would become. People who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who stood in their way. Something ancient stirred within her, a memory of balance and centered power that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with truth. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years, speaking in Cantonese about the way of Wing Chun. "When pressure comes, do not resist. When space appears, do not hesitate. The tree that bends in the wind outlasts the one that breaks." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight settling into the balls of her feet, her hands relaxing at her sides. To any observer, she appeared unchanged, still the quiet, understated teacher trying to solve a simple problem. But beneath the surface, something had awakened, something that had been dormant, but never truly asleep. "Expectations," she repeated, softly, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose it's important to understand what people expect from each other." The parking lot had grown quiet around them, the last of the faculty cars disappearing into the gathering dusk. Streetlights flickered on automatically, casting long shadows between the vehicles and creating pools of amber light on the asphalt. In this isolated moment, with witnesses gone and pretenses dropping, Sarah realized she was about to learn exactly what kind of place Riverside Academy really was, and perhaps, she thought as her breathing naturally deepened and her awareness expanded to encompass every movement around her, it was time for these 3 students to learn something about expectations as well. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of traffic beyond the academies. Iron gates. Sarah's eyes moved methodically from Marcus to Brooklyn to Cameron, reading their body language with the precision of someone trained to assess threats in milliseconds. Their casual formation wasn't accidental. Marcus positioned directly in front of her, Brooklyn to her left, cutting off the path to the main building, Cameron to her right, blocking access to the street. They had done this before. "You know," Marcus said, sliding his hands into his pockets with practiced nonchalance, "Riverside Academy has certain traditions, ways of doing things that might not be immediately obvious to someone from the outside." Sarah tilted her head slightly, a gesture that could have been interpreted as curiosity or confusion. In reality, it was neither. She was calculating angles, measuring distances, noting how Marcus's weight favored his left leg and how Brooklyn's designer heels would limit her mobility on the uneven asphalt. Old habits died hard, even when buried under years of deliberate pacifism. "I'm always interested in learning about institutional culture," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in faculty meetings. "What kind of traditions did you have in mind?" Brooklyn's laugh was like breaking glass wrapped in silk. "Oh, it's nothing formal. More like understanding your place in the ecosystem. Every successful organization has hierarchies, don't you think? Natural orders that keep things running smoothly." Cameron nodded sagely, his dark eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Take our previous English teacher, Mrs. Patterson," she thought. She could ignore certain realities about how things work here, always trying to level the playing field with her grading, giving special attention to students who didn't necessarily deserve it, making waves. Making waves can be exhausting. Marcus added, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. Mrs. Patterson found that out the hard way. Amazing how quickly things can go wrong when you're fighting the current instead of flowing with it. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The mysterious departure of her predecessor, the careful way other faculty members had avoided discussing it, the subtle tension she'd sensed in the administration office when they'd mentioned her replacement status. Mrs. Patterson hadn't left voluntarily. What happened to her? Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the growing certainty that she was about to hear something unpleasant. Brooklyn examined her perfectly, manicured nails with theatrical interest. "Oh, you know how these things go. Social media can be so unpredictable. One day someone's photos from their college years surface, nothing illegal of course, but perhaps not entirely appropriate for someone in a position of moral authority. Then there are the student complaints about inappropriate comments, favoritism, and general unprofessionalism. Funny how quickly things snowball," Cameron added, "especially when parents start asking questions about whether their children are receiving the quality of education they're paying for." Marcus stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else. The sharp, metallic smell of calculated cruelty. "The thing is, Miss Chun, Mrs. Patterson could have avoided all of that unpleasantness. All she had to do was understand her role, accept the natural order of things. But she insisted on being difficult." The word hung in the air like a blade, and Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that she was being offered a choice. Submit to whatever game they wanted to play, or face the same systematic destruction that had claimed her predecessor. It was an elegant trap, really. Deny them, and they would manufacture evidence of wrongdoing. Submit, and they would own her completely. In the growing darkness, Sarah's grandmother's voice seemed to whisper across the years, carrying lessons learned in a different time and place. The strongest tree appears to bend but its roots run deep. Let the storm think it has won, then show it the mountain beneath. I see, Sarah said finally, her tone suggesting careful consideration rather than defiance. And what exactly would accepting this natural order involve? Brooklyn's smile was triumphant, the expression of a hunter who had watched prey walk willingly into the snare. Nothing too complicated. Small things, really. Flexible grading standards for certain students. Understanding when to ask questions and when to mind your own business. Being part of the team instead of working against it. And if there are ever any misunderstandings about your teaching methods, Cameron added smoothly, we'd be happy to vouch for your professionalism. Student testimonials can be very powerful in situations where accusations might arise. Marcus pulled a key ring from his pocket, dangling it just out of Sarah's reach. The keys caught the amber light from the street lamps, each small piece of metal representing her autonomy, her ability to leave this place on her own terms. Of course, cooperation works both ways. Trust has to be earned through demonstrated loyalty. Sarah stared at her keys, understanding the symbolism perfectly. They weren't just holding her car keys hostage. They were making it clear that nothing in her life would remain private, secure, or under her control unless she played by their rules. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, refined through years of practice on teachers, administrators, and fellow students who had dared to challenge their authority. May I ask you something? Sarah said, taking a step closer to Marcus. Her movement was fluid, natural, but it brought her within arm's reach of her keys. How long have you been doing this? Marcus's smile widened, interpreting her proximity as capitulation. Long enough to perfect the system. You'd be amazed how quickly people learn to appreciate structure when the alternative is chaos. And your parents? Are they aware of your leadership techniques? Brooklyn laughed outright at that. Please, do you think they got where they are by playing nice? They're proud of us for learning early what it takes to succeed in the real world. Power respects power, Miss Chun. Everything else is just sentiment. Sarah nodded slowly, as if processing this wisdom. In reality, she was processing something entirely different. The exact distance between her hand and the keys. The way Marcus's confidence had made him careless with his guard. The angle she would need to move through to retrieve what was hers without causing permanent damage. So Mrs. Patterson's mistake, Sarah said conversationally, was trying to fight a system she couldn't change instead of working within it. Exactly, Cameron said, pleased that she seemed to be grasping the lesson. She thought principles mattered. More than pragmatism. Noble, maybe, but ultimately self-destructive. And the three of you represent this system? We represent reality, Marcus said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never been truly challenged. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be for everyone involved. Sarah looked at each of them again, noting how their body language had relaxed as they sensed victory approaching. Brooklyn had shifted her weight to one hip, no longer maintaining her blocking position. Cameron had pulled out his phone, already moving on to whatever entertainment would fill the remainder of his evening. Marcus held the keys loosely now. More trophy than leverage. I have one more question, Sarah said, her voice softer now, almost contemplative. When you took my keys during the fire drill, were you already planning this conversation, or was it spontaneous? The question caught them off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how casually she had acknowledged their theft. There was no accusation in her tone, no anger or indignation. If anything, she sounded impressed by their planning. Marcus recovered first, his smile becoming more genuine as he mistook her calm for admiration. A little of both. We'd been watching you, waiting for the right opportunity to have this discussion. The fire drill just provided the perfect opening. Efficient, Sarah acknowledged. And taking them during the evacuation was smart, too much. Chaos for anyone to notice, too many people moving around to establish a timeline. Brooklyn pretended at what she interpreted as professional respect. We've learned that timing is everything. Strike when your opponent is distracted, vulnerable, off balance. Sound philosophy, Sarah agreed, and something in her tone made Cameron look up from his phone. Some ancient instinct recognizing a shift in the atmosphere that his conscious mind couldn't quite place. Sarah's stance had changed almost imperceptibly. Her weight was now perfectly centered, her breathing deeper and more rhythmic. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but there was something different about the way she held them. Not the careful restraint of someone trying to appear harmless, but the relaxed readiness of someone who no longer needed to. "There's just one thing I'm curious about," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a quality that none of them had heard before, quieter but somehow more present, like the moment of absolute stillness before lightning strikes. "In all your planning and timing and strategic thinking, did you ever consider that you might be making assumptions about who you were dealing with?" The question hung in the air between them, and for the first time since the conversation began, none of the three had an immediate response. Something had shifted in the dynamic, some fundamental change that they couldn't identify, but could definitely feel. Marcus's grip on the keys tightened reflexively. Brooklyn straightened from her casual pose, and Cameron slipped his phone back into his pocket, his attention now fully focused on Sarah's face. They had started this encounter as predators toying with prey, but suddenly they weren't entirely certain which role they were playing. Sarah smiled then, an expression of such serene confidence that it sent a chill down Brooklyn's spine. It wasn't the smile of someone who had accepted defeat or recognized superior power. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game they thought they were playing wasn't the game being played at all. "Because," Sarah said, taking another step forward, "sometimes the tree that looks like it's bending is actually just getting into position to spring back." The atmosphere in the parking lot had transformed completely. What began as a casual demonstration of power had evolved into something none of the three students could quite define. Sarah's presence seemed to fill the space around them, not through aggression or raised voice, but through an absolute stillness that made the autumn air feel electric. Marcus's confident smile faltered as he found himself truly looking at Sarah Chun for the first time. The woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the quiet, unassuming teacher who had spent the last 3 days navigating their classroom provocations with diplomatic patience. Her posture hadn't changed dramatically. She wasn't adopting some obvious fighting stance or making threatening gestures, but something fundamental had shifted in the way she occupied space. "You know," Sarah said, her voice carrying a conversational tone that somehow made her words more unsettling than any shout, "I had a teacher once who told me that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming you understand your opponent's capabilities based on their apparent willingness to engage." Brooklyn took an unconscious step backward, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sarah's eyes found Brooklyn's, and the younger woman felt a jolt of recognition. This was how apex predators looked at potential threats, with the kind of focused attention that meant the difference between life and death. "It means that sometimes what looks like weakness is actually restraint, and sometimes restraint is just good manners." Cameron's hand moved toward his phone again, some instinct telling him to document whatever was about to happen, but Sarah's gaze shifted to him with laser precision. "I wouldn't," she said simply, and something in her tone made his hand freeze mid-motion. "You're starting to worry me, Miss Chun," Marcus said, trying to inject authority back into his voice. "It sounds like you're considering doing something inadvisable, something that could have serious consequences for your career." Sarah tilted her head, studying him with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. "My career," she repeated thoughtfully. "You mean the one you're threatening to destroy anyway? The position you've Already decided I don't deserve unless I submit to your particular form of institutional terrorism. The words hung in the air like accusation and revelation combined. Brooklyn's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Cameron's carefully maintained neutral expression cracked to reveal something approaching the alarm. Marcus's grip on the keys shifted, his knuckles whitening as he clutched them like a talisman against forces he was only beginning to comprehend. Terrorism is a strong word, Marcus said, his voice losing some of its practiced smoothness. We're just helping you understand how things work here. By destroying the life and reputation of anyone who doesn't cooperate with your agenda? Sarah asked, by using your parents' influence to systematically eliminate teachers who show integrity. By creating an environment where education takes a backseat to your entertainment? She took another step forward, and this time all three of them noticed the way she moved, fluid, centered, with the kind of unconscious grace that spoke of years spent training body and mind to work as a unified weapon. Tell me, Marcus, how many teachers have you driven away? How many promising educators have you convinced to abandon their calling because it was easier than fighting your family's lawyers? Marcus's jaw tightened, but Sarah wasn't finished. And you, Brooklyn, how many of your classmates have you psychologically tormented because they dared to succeed without your permission? How many young people have you taught that cruelty is just another form of currency? Brooklyn's face flushed red, whether from anger or shame was impossible to tell. You don't know anything about, and Cameron, Sarah continued, her attention shifting to the third member of their group. How many secrets have you collected? How many lives have you held hostage with information that should never have been yours to possess? Cameron's composure cracked entirely. You can't talk to us like this. Do you have any idea who our parents are? One phone call from my father could what? Sarah interrupted, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was heat in her voice. Could ruin me the way you ruined Mrs. Patterson? Could destroy my reputation the way you've destroyed how many others? She was close enough now that Marcus could see flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could smell the faint scent of jasmine from her hair. More unsettling was what he couldn't see: fear, uncertainty, the desperate calculation of someone trying to negotiate from a position of weakness. Instead, he saw something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he'd rarely experienced: genuine concern for his own safety. Let me tell you what I know about your parents, Sarah said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. I know that Marcus's father sits on the Supreme Court because he learned early how to mask ruthless ambition behind judicial propriety. I know that Brooklyn's father built his media empire by destroying people's lives for profit and calling it news. And I know that Cameron's father turned real estate development into a form of legalized theft. Their shocked silence was absolute. This wasn't information that appeared in school records or faculty briefings. This was the kind of knowledge that came from serious research, from understanding exactly who she was dealing with and what resources they could bring to bear. The question is, Sarah continued, do you think any of them would appreciate knowing that their children have been running an extortion ring out of one of the most prestigious schools in Connecticut? Do you imagine they'd be pleased to discover that their legacy projects, you have been conducting yourselves like common criminals? Marcus's face had gone pale. You're bluffing. You have no proof of anything. Sarah smiled, and the expression was both beautiful and terrifying. Proof is such an interesting concept, don't you think? Mrs. Patterson probably thought she needed proof too, right up until she discovered that in your world, accusation and reality are often treated as the same thing. She reached into her blazer pocket, and all three students tensed, unsure what she might produce. What emerged was simply her cell phone, but the way she held it suggested possibilities none of them had considered. You see, I've spent the last 3 days doing what good teachers do: paying attention, watching, learning, and what I've learned Is that you've been documenting your own crimes for years? Social media posts celebrating your victories. Text message chains discussing strategy. Video evidence of your handiwork that you've shared with friends because you never imagined anyone would dare to challenge you. Brooklyn's hand flew to her own phone, panic flashing across her features as she realized the implications. Every cruel post, every mocking video, every carefully orchestrated humiliation they documented as trophies could become evidence in the wrong hands. But here's what really interests me, Sarah continued, her thumb moving across her phone screen with practiced efficiency. I've also discovered something you clearly didn't expect. I'm not Mrs. Patterson. I'm not some idealistic educator who believes the system will protect her if she just follows the rules. I'm someone who learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to speak their language. Marcus lunged forward then, desperation overriding caution as he reached for her phone. It was a clumsy, emotionally driven attack, the kind of move someone makes when panic clouds their judgment. For someone trained in Wing Chun, it might as well have been slow motion. Sarah's response was so fluid it seemed choreographed. Her phone disappeared into her pocket as her body shifted slightly to the side, creating just enough space for Marcus's grasping hand to pass harmlessly by her shoulder. Her own hand moved in a tight, controlled arc, fingers extended, striking upward to connect with a specific point just below his wrist. The impact was precise, targeted, and absolutely devastating in its effect. Marcus's hand opened involuntarily, his fingers suddenly unable to maintain their grip as nerve pathways scrambled to process what had just happened. The key ring tumbled through the air, metal jingling against metal as it fell. Sarah's other hand moved in a blur, catching the keys before they could hit the ground. The entire exchange had taken perhaps 2 seconds, but in those seconds, the fundamental power dynamic between them had shifted completely. Marcus staggered backward, clutching his wrist and staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock and dawning terror. What ... how did you ... Wing Chun, Sarah said simply, as if that explained everything. Which, in a way, it did. It's a martial art developed by a woman for defeating opponents who are bigger and stronger, but rely on brute force instead. OF technique. Very effective against people who've never learned that real power comes from understanding rather than intimidation. Brooklyn and Cameron had frozen completely, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The quiet English teacher had just disarmed Marcus Hartwell, 6 feet of privileged athlete, with what appeared to be the casual swipe of her hand. The beautiful thing about Wing Chun, Sarah continued, examining her recovered keys with satisfaction, is that it teaches you to use your opponent's aggression against them. The harder they come at you, the more devastating their defeat. It's really quite philosophical when you think about it. She looked up at the 3 of them, and her smile was radiant with genuine pleasure. Now then, I believe we were discussing expectations and natural order. Shall we continue that conversation? The 3 students stood in silence, their carefully constructed world of assumed superiority crumbling around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. Marcus continued to cradle his wrist, flexing his fingers experimentally as sensation slowly returned. The casual ease with which Sarah had neutralized his attack had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of power dynamics. Sarah pocketed her keys with deliberate slowness, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. When she spoke again, her voice carried the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, and the absolute certainty that she now controlled every aspect of their interaction. I suppose you're wondering how a quiet English teacher from a modest background learned to do that, she said, settling back into a relaxed stance that somehow managed to suggest both accessibility and absolute readiness. It's an interesting story, actually. One that begins in a very different place than Riverside Academy. Brooklyn found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're not really a teacher, are you? Sarah's laugh was genuine, warm even, but it carried undertones that made all three students distinctly uncomfortable. Oh, but I am. I have the credentials, the student teaching experience, the genuine desire to shape young minds through literature. What I also have is a rather unconventional background that most educational institutions don't typically list in their faculty biographies. She began to pace slowly, not the agitated movement of someone trying to burn off nervous energy, but the measured steps of a predator defining territory. You see, before I discovered my passion for teaching, I spent several years in Hong Kong. Beautiful city, fascinating culture, and home to some of the most traditional Wing Chun schools in the world. Cameron's phone had remained forgotten in his hand, though his fingers twitched occasionally toward the record button. Some survival instinct warned him that documenting this conversation might not serve his interests, regardless of whatever leverage it might provide later. I wasn't there as a tourist, Sarah continued, her eyes distant as she accessed memories she'd kept carefully buried. I was there running from something, actually. A life that had become complicated. Corporate law, if you can believe it. 60-hour weeks, moral compromises that compounded daily, the gradual erosion of everything I thought I believed in. Marcus struggled to reconcile this revelation with the woman standing before them. Corporate law? Mergers and acquisitions, specifically. I helped large corporations absorb smaller ones, usually destroying communities and livelihoods in the process. Very lucrative work, very soul-destroying results. Sarah's tone remained conversational, but something harder crept into her expression. I was quite good at it, actually. Good enough that I developed a reputation for being thorough. When I targeted a company for acquisition, it stayed acquired. The parallels weren't lost on any of them. Here was someone who had operated in their parents' world, who understood the mechanisms of power they took for granted, who had chosen to walk away from it all. But Hong Kong, Sarah said, her voice softening slightly. Hong Kong changed everything. I'd gone there initially to handle a particularly complex international acquisition, but something about the city got under my skin. The way ancient traditions coexisted with cutting-edge modernity. The respect for wisdom that transcended material success. She paused in her pacing, turning to face them directly, and the Wing Chun schools, hidden in plain sight throughout the city, preserving knowledge that was thousands of years old. I started training as a way to deal with stress, to find some balance in a life that had become entirely about destruction and accumulation. Brooklyn's worldview was struggling to accommodate this new information. So you just learned Kung Fu as a hobby? Wing Chun, Sarah corrected gently. And no, not as a hobby, as a way of life. Wing Chun isn't just about fighting techniques, though those are certainly effective. It's about understanding force and flow, about responding to aggression without becoming aggressive yourself, about finding the center that remains calm regardless of the chaos around it. Marcus had been listening with growing unease, recognizing something in Sarah's tone that spoke of profound personal transformation. But you came back, you became a teacher. I did, Sarah acknowledged, because I realized that the principles I was learning in those Hong Kong dojos weren't just applicable to physical confrontations. They were life philosophies that could be applied to education, to human development, to creating positive change instead of perpetual destruction. She reached into her blazer again, this time producing a small, worn photograph. The image showed a younger Sarah in traditional kung fu attire, standing beside an elderly Chinese man in a position of obvious respect and instruction. Master Liu, she said, holding the photograph so they could see it. 87 years old when this was taken, and capable of defeating opponents a third his age without breaking a sweat. He taught me that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to know when domination is unnecessary. Cameron finally found his voice, though it came out strained. "So why are you telling us this?" Sarah's smile was enigmatic as she tucked the photograph away. "Because you need to understand what you're really dealing with. You've built your entire social strategy around the assumption that teachers are inherently vulnerable, that we're forced to operate within systems that favor you. But what happens when you encounter someone who understands your system better than you do, and who has the skills to operate outside it entirely?" The question hung in the cooling air like a challenge wrapped in a threat. These three students had spent years perfecting the art of psychological warfare, but they were discovering that their opponent had been trained in forms of conflict resolution they'd never imagined. Master Liu used to tell his students a story. Sarah continued, settling into what was clearly a teaching mode despite the unconventional classroom. About a young tree that grew up in a forest dominated by much larger, older trees. The young tree spent years being overshadowed, getting only the light that filtered down through the canopy, never able to grow to its full potential. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this metaphor might be leading. One day, a terrible storm came through the forest. All the large trees, so proud of their size and strength, tried to stand firm against the wind. They broke, one by one, their rigid trunks snapping under pressure they refused to accommodate. But the young tree, which had learned to be flexible, to bend without breaking, survived the storm intact. Brooklyn's voice was barely audible. And then, Sarah said with quiet satisfaction, the young tree had all the sunlight it needed to grow into exactly what it was meant to become. The metaphor's implications were clear, but Sarah wasn't finished with her lesson. "You see, the three of you have been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about power dynamics. You believe that, because you can destroy people within existing systems, you're inherently stronger than they are. But what you've never encountered is someone who doesn't need those systems to protect them." She moved closer to Marcus, and he instinctively stepped backward, still cradling his wrist. "When you threatened Mrs. Patterson, she fought back using the only tools she knew: appeals to administration, attempts to document your harassment, formal complaints that went nowhere because your parents' influence outweighed her evidence." Another step forward, and Marcus found himself backed against a parked car. "But I'm not Mrs. Patterson. I don't need the administration to believe me, or the school board to support me, or your parents' approval to validate my existence." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "I need only what I carry with me, the knowledge that comes from years of serious training, the connections that come from understanding how power really works, and the absolute certainty that I can protect myself and the students in my care, regardless of what your families might try to do about it." Cameron finally worked up the courage to speak, though his voice shook slightly. "You're threatening us." Sarah's expression shifted to one of mild surprise, as if the suggestion was completely unexpected. "Threatening you? Not at all. I'm educating you. There's a significant difference." She stepped back, giving Marcus room to breathe while maintaining the psychological pressure that had all three of them thoroughly off balance. "You see, Wing Chun teaches that the best victory is the one where no actual fighting takes place, where the opponent recognizes the futility of aggression and chooses a different path entirely." Brooklyn tried to inject some of her previous authority into her voice. "And if we don't choose this different path?" Sarah's smile was radiant, genuinely warm, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "Then you'll discover that while I may have left corporate law behind, I retained all the skills that made me successful in that environment. The difference is that now I use those skills to protect people instead of destroying them." She pulled out her phone again, this time opening what appeared to be a voice recording app. "Which brings us to the real purpose of tonight's conversation. You're going to help me understand exactly how your operation works, who else has been affected by it, and what needs to be done to ensure it never happens again." Marcus's face went white. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am," Sarah said, her finger hovering over the record button. And the beautiful thing about this approach is that it gives you the opportunity to be part of the solution instead of simply being eliminated as part of the problem. Master Liu would call this redirecting energy toward positive outcomes. The three students exchanged panicked glances, finally beginning to understand that their encounter with the quiet English teacher had evolved far beyond anything they'd anticipated or prepared for. "Now then," Sarah said pleasantly, "shall we begin with Mrs. Patterson? Or would you prefer to start with some of your other victims?" The red recording light on Sarah's phone seemed to pulse with ominous significance in the gathering darkness. Street lamps cast elongated shadows across the parking lot, creating a theatrical atmosphere that made the moment feel both surreal and inevitable. The three students stood frozen, each lost in private calculations about consequences, escape routes, and the rapidly diminishing menu of options available to them. Brooklyn broke first, her carefully constructed facade cracking under pressure. She'd never experienced before. "This is insane. You can't just force us to force." Sarah interrupted, her tone genuinely puzzled. "I'm not forcing anything. I'm simply offering you an opportunity to take responsibility for your actions. Think of it as an extended version of the character development exercises we've been exploring in class." Marcus had recovered enough sensation in his hand to clench it into a fist, though he was careful to keep it at his side. "You think you're clever, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. My father has friends in the FBI. Brooklyn's family owns half the media outlets in the Northeast. Cameron's father could have you audited, investigated, and destroyed before you even knew what hit you." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering this information. "All true, I'm sure. But here's what I find interesting about your threat assessment. It assumes I'm operating within the same framework of vulnerability that trapped Mrs. Patterson." She began moving in a slow circle around them, not menacingly, but with the casual authority of someone conducting a seminar. "You see, when I was working on corporate acquisitions, I learned something very valuable about powerful families. They're absolutely ruthless when dealing with threats to their interests, but they're also pragmatic. They don't waste resources on battles they can't win, especially when those battles might expose information they'd prefer to keep private." Cameron's phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it reflexively. Sarah noticed the movement and smiled. "Expecting rescue? I should mention that I took the liberty of having your parents' personal assistants informed that you'd be staying late for academic enrichment. They won't expect you home for several hours." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not only had Sarah anticipated their potential escape strategies, she'd actively blocked them. Brooklyn's voice cracked as she spoke. "You contacted our families?" "Professional courtesy calls," Sarah explained serenely. "I introduced myself as your new English teacher and expressed how impressed I was with your leadership potential. I suggested that some additional mentoring time would help you reach your full academic potential." She paused, her circling directly in front of Marcus, close enough that he could see the absolute confidence in her dark eyes. "Your father's assistant was particularly enthusiastic about your commitment to extracurricular learning. Apparently, he's been hoping you'd develop more, shall we say, character-building experiences." The implication was subtle but devastating. Supreme Court Justice. Hartwell's reputation rested heavily on his image as a moral authority. Learning that his son had been running extortion schemes at an elite academy would be personally humiliating and professionally catastrophic. "Now then," Sarah continued, settling back into her teaching persona, "let's begin with some basic questions. Brooklyn, since you seem eager to contribute, why don't you start by explaining the social media component of your operation?" Brooklyn's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her media-trained instincts warring with genuine panic. She'd spent years learning to manipulate information flow, but she'd never been on the receiving end of a skilled interrogation. Sarah waited patiently, the recording app capturing every second of silence. Take your time. I know it can be difficult to organize your thoughts when you're processing new information. Perhaps it would help if I shared some of what I've already discovered. Without waiting for permission, Sarah pulled up what appeared to be a social media monitoring app on her phone. Fascinating technology, really. Cross-platform analytics that can track deleted posts, archived content, even private messages when certain legal thresholds are met. Cameron went pale. You can't access private messages without a warrant. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed cheerfully. Unless, of course, one of the participants in those conversations chooses to share them voluntarily. Amazing how many people are willing to cooperate when they realize their own liability in criminal enterprises. She scrolled through what appeared to be a comprehensive database of social media activity. For instance, I've been having fascinating conversations with former students who graduated in the last few years. Jenny Martinez was particularly helpful in explaining how your group systematically destroyed her college application process when she refused to write your history papers. For you, Brooklyn's face was drained of color. Jenny Martinez had been a scholarship student whose academic record had been mysteriously sabotaged during her senior year, resulting in the loss of several prestigious university acceptances. Then there's David Park, Sarah continued conversationally. Currently a sophomore at Columbia, still receiving therapy for anxiety disorders that developed during his time here. He was quite detailed in describing how you three convinced the administration that he'd been cheating on standardized tests. Marcus found his voice, though it came out strained. Those are just allegations, hearsay from disgruntled former students. Sarah's smile was patient, the expression of a teacher dealing with a particularly slow learner. Marcus, you're thinking like someone who's never had to build a legal case. Hearsay becomes evidence when it's corroborated by documentation, digital forensics, and pattern analysis. She switched to a different app, this one displaying what appeared to be a complex timeline with dozens of interconnected data points. 3 years of systematic harassment, documented through social media posts, email threads, witness statements, and financial records. Did you know that Cameron's father's shell company owns the digital marketing firm that your group hired to boost negative content about your victims? Cameron's legs gave out slightly, and he had to lean against a nearby car for support. The connection between his father's business interests and their school activities was something that had never occurred to him. But Sarah was right. The paper trail would be devastating if exposed. But here's what really impressed me, Sarah continued, warming to her subject like a professor delivering a favorite lecture. The sophistication of your psychological manipulation techniques. Brooklyn, your understanding of trauma bonding and social isolation would be remarkable if it weren't being used to destroy your peers. Brooklyn finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What do you want from us? Sarah's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked like nothing more than a concerned teacher trying to help troubled students. I want you to understand that actions have consequences, that power comes with responsibility, and that it's never too late to choose a different path. She gestured toward the recording app. This conversation can go one of two ways. You can continue trying to protect a system that's ultimately going to destroy you anyway, or you can help me understand how to fix the damage you've caused and prevent it from happening to future students. Marcus straightened, trying to summon some of his previous authority. And if we refuse? Sarah's tone remained gentle, but her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then I'll proceed with the evidence I've already gathered, the testimonies I've already collected, and the connections I've already documented. Your parents will learn about your activities through federal investigators, rather than through a conversation with a teacher who genuinely wants to help you become better people. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of years of accumulated cruelty and the sudden recognition that their actions had finally encountered consequences they couldn't manipulate or escape. Clock's ticking, Sarah said softly, glancing at her phone's timer. Your parents expect you home in 3 hours. That's enough time for a full confession, a discussion of remediation strategies, and a plan for making amends to your victims. Or it's enough time for me to finalize the evidence packages I'll be delivering to the appropriate authorities tomorrow morning. Brooklyn broke completely then, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face as the full weight of their situation crashed over her. We never meant for it to go this far. It started as just pranks, ways to stay entertained. Sarah nodded encouragingly, her finger still hovering over the record button. Tell me about the pranks, Brooklyn. Help me understand how entertainment became extortion. And as the confession began, 3 of Riverside Academy's most powerful students discovered that their reign of terror was finally coming to an end, not through administrative intervention or parental discipline, but through the patient, methodical justice of someone who understood their world better than they'd ever imagined possible. Brooklyn's confession started as a trickle, hesitant words falling into the digital recorder like drops of water from a crack in a dam. But once the first admission escaped her lips, the floodgates opened with devastating force. Years of carefully compartmentalized cruelty came pouring out in a torrent of guilt, justification, and desperate attempts at self-preservation. It really did start small, she said, her voice barely audible as she stared at the ground. Freshman year, there was this girl, Rebecca Walsh. She was different, homeschooled until high school, didn't understand the social dynamics, kept trying to be friends with everyone. Sarah maintained her patient silence, allowing the confession to flow naturally while her phone captured every word. The autumn night had grown colder, but none of them seemed to notice the temperature drop. Marcus said she was disrupting the natural order, Brooklyn continued, her words coming faster now. Rebecca would sit with different groups at lunch, not respecting the established hierarchies. She'd ask questions in class that made some of us look bad, always raising her hand, always eager to participate. Marcus shot Brooklyn a warning glare. But she was beyond caring about their previous agreements to maintain solidarity. The psychological pressure Sarah had applied was working exactly as intended, isolating each of them within their own growing panic. So we started redirecting her enthusiasm, Brooklyn said, her choice of words unconsciously echoing the corporate euphemisms she'd absorbed from her media executive father. Small things at first. Moved her lunch tray when she wasn't looking. Accidentally bumped into her in the hallways. Made sure she overheard conversations about how annoying tryhards were. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes had taken on the focused intensity of a prosecutor building a case. And Rebecca's response? She tried harder, Cameron interjected, his voice hollow. That's what made it so effective. Instead of backing down, she kept trying to fit in, kept trying to prove she belonged here, which just made her seem more desperate. Brooklyn nodded, tears continuing to stream down her face. We convinced ourselves we were teaching her valuable social lessons. That's what Marcus called it, social education. We were helping her understand how the real world worked. By systematically destroying her confidence, Sarah observed quietly. By showing her the consequences of not understanding boundaries. Marcus corrected, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. Rebecca needed to learn that actions have social costs. We were just accelerating that education. Sarah studied Marcus with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing a particularly interesting psychological specimen. And when did this social education evolve into something more sophisticated? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment, none of them spoke. Then Cameron, perhaps calculating that cooperation might minimize his own liability, began to fill in the gaps. Sophomore year, he said reluctantly. Brooklyn's father had just acquired 3 local newspapers and a radio station. She started talking about narrative control, about how information flow determined social reality. Brooklyn's face flushed with shame and anger. Don't put this on my family's business model. But that's exactly what it was, Cameron pressed. His own survival instincts overriding loyalty. You said we could apply media strategies to school social dynamics. Create stories, control messaging, shape perceptions. Sarah's phone captured every word of their growing conflict, the bonds of their alliance dissolving under pressure. This too was calculated. She understood that criminals almost always turned on each other when faced with consequences, and she was expertly facilitating that process. Explain the media strategies, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to depositions and interrogations. Brooklyn wiped her eyes, smearing her makeup but seeming not to care. Market research first. We identified target demographics, students who were vulnerable, isolated, or threatening to existing power structures. Then we developed campaign strategies tailored to each target's psychological profile. The clinical language was chilling in its implications. These weren't teenagers acting on impulse. They were conducting systematic psychological warfare with the sophistication of professional operatives. Rebecca Walsh was our proof of concept, Brooklyn continued, her voice growing steadier as she slipped into analytical mode. We documented everything, her responses to different stimuli, which approaches were most effective, how long it took for various techniques to produce measurable results. Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest, but her expression remained composed. What kind of results? Social isolation first, Cameron answered, his own analytical nature taking over. We tracked her lunch table selections, monitored who she tried to sit with, and documented the success rate of our intervention strategies. Marcus had been listening with growing alarm as his co-conspirators detailed their operation with devastating specificity. You're making it sound more calculated than it was, wasn't it? Brooklyn shot back, her grief transforming into anger. You kept spreadsheets, Marcus. Color-coded charts tracking our target's vulnerabilities and response patterns. You called it optimization analytics. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. Spreadsheets? Marcus's face went ashen as he realized the implications. Documentary evidence of their activities stored digitally, potentially recoverable even if deleted. His legal training from growing up in a Supreme Court justice's household was finally kicking in, and he understood exactly how damaging such records could be. We need to stop talking, he said desperately. All of us. Right now. But Brooklyn was beyond stopping, her confession having taken on a momentum of its own. The spreadsheets tracked everything. Target selection, vulnerability assessment, strategy, implementation, success metrics. Rebecca Walsh was just the beginning. She turned to face Sarah directly, her eyes red with tears, but burning with a strange intensity. Do you want to know what our success metrics were? How did we measure whether our campaigns were working? Sarah nodded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Suicide ideation indicators, Brooklyn said, her voice flat and emotionless. We tracked signs of depression, self-harm behaviors, and social withdrawal patterns. We had a point system for different levels of psychological breakdown. The confession hit like a physical blow, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Her grandmother's teachings about redirecting aggression, rather than meeting it with force, were being severely tested by the revelation that these students had been conducting systematic psychological torture with the precision of war criminals. Cameron seemed to realize that Brooklyn's admissions were incriminating all of them beyond any hope of damage control. We never actually wanted anyone to hurt themselves, he said quickly. The tracking was just data collection. Academic interest. Academic interest, Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous edge, in driving children to consider suicide. We didn't drive anyone to that, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. People make their own choices about how they respond to social pressures. Sarah's phone continued recording as she processed the full scope of what they were admitting. These weren't typical teenage bullies acting out of insecurity or social awkwardness. They were conducting psychological warfare with methodical precision, treating their classmates' mental health as variables in an experimental design. "Tell me about the other targets," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. Brooklyn looked at Marcus and Cameron, both of whom had gone silent, leaving her to carry the burden of confession alone. There were 12 major campaigns over 3 years. Rebecca was first, but she wasn't the worst. Who was the worst? Daniel Kim, Brooklyn whispered. Junior year. He was valedictorian track, full scholarship potential, planning to be a doctor like his parents. But he had social anxiety, struggled with public speaking. Sarah waited, allowing the silence to draw out more details. "We decided he was getting too much academic attention," Cameron said reluctantly. "Teachers were using him as an example of excellence, which made the rest of us look lazy by comparison. So we developed a comprehensive destabilization campaign," Brooklyn continued. "Social media harassment through anonymous accounts, academic sabotage, escalating psychological pressure designed to trigger his anxiety disorders." Marcus had buried his face in his hands, finally understanding that their admissions were being preserved for posterity. "We filmed his panic attacks," he said, his voice muffled. "Posted them online with commentary about how academic pressure reveals true character." Sarah's training in Wing Chun emphasized emotional control, the importance of remaining centered regardless of external circumstances. But the image of frightened children being systematically tortured by their peers was testing every limit of her restraint. "What happened to Daniel?" she asked. "Hospitalization," Brooklyn said quietly. "Complete psychological breakdown during a P testing. His parents pulled him out of school, enrolled him in private therapy, and moved the family to California to get him away from the trauma triggers." The parking lot had grown completely silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the sound of Brooklyn's quiet sobbing. The confession had taken on a life of its own, each admission leading to another, each revelation more damaging than the last. "The most effective technique we developed," Cameron said, his voice mechanical as if he were reading from a report, "was something we called reality distortion. We would systematically alter a target's social environment to make them question their own perceptions and judgments." Sarah's background in corporate law had exposed her to white-collar criminality, but the casual cruelty these teenagers described was beyond anything she'd encountered in professional contexts. "Explain reality distortion," she said. "Coordinated gaslighting," Brooklyn answered. "We would convince groups of students to participate in subtle behavioral modifications around specific targets, change conversation topics when they approached, respond to their comments with confusion or dismissal, act like they were remembering events incorrectly. The goal was to isolate them psychologically," Marcus added, his resistance finally crumbling completely. "If you can convince someone that their perception of reality is fundamentally flawed, they become completely dependent on external validation, which we controlled." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that these 3 students represented a level of calculated evil that transcended typical adolescent cruelty. They had systematically studied psychological manipulation and applied it with scientific precision to destroy their peers' mental health. How many students were subjected to reality distortion campaigns? She asked. Cameron consulted his phone, apparently accessing some kind of digital record. 7 major implementations with varying degrees of success. The most effective was Lisa Rodriguez. She ended up in residential psychiatric care for 6 months. The confession continued for another hour, each revelation more damaging than the last. They detailed their techniques for academic sabotage, described how they had manipulated teachers and administrators, explained their methods for recruiting other students as unwitting accomplices in their campaigns, Sarah's phone captured everything. Names, dates, specific incidents, the cold analytical language they used to describe psychological torture. By the time they finished, she had documented evidence of systematic harassment that had destroyed multiple lives and corrupted the educational environment at one of the nation's most prestigious private schools. As the confessions finally wound down, the three students sat in stunned silence, apparently realizing for the first time the full scope of what they had done and what they had just admitted to doing. The parking lot felt like a crime scene, which in many ways it had become. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, seeing not the confident predators who had tried to intimidate her hours earlier, but three deeply damaged young people who had somehow convinced themselves that cruelty was a form of education and that destroying others was a legitimate expression of power. "Now," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of judgment, "we're going to discuss what happens next." The parking lot had transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with Sarah as both judge and jury presiding over three defendants who had finally grasped the magnitude of their crimes. The digital recording on her phone contained enough evidence to destroy their futures completely. But as she studied their faces in the amber glow of the streetlights, she found herself thinking not of punishment, but of the Wing Chun principle that had guided her transformation in Hong Kong. The strongest victory is achieved when your opponent chooses to surrender their aggression willingly. "The evidence we've gathered tonight," Sarah began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone delivering a verdict, "documents criminal behavior that spans multiple jurisdictions and involves numerous felony charges: conspiracy, harassment, cyberbullying with intent to cause emotional distress, academic fraud, and what most prosecutors would classify as systematic psychological torture." Marcus had gone completely pale, his legal training finally allowing him to understand the full scope of their vulnerability. "You're talking about federal charges. Civil rights violations, at minimum," Sarah confirmed. "The interstate nature of your social media campaigns, the targeting of students based on protected characteristics, the coordination across multiple platforms. Any competent federal prosecutor would see this as a textbook RICO case." Brooklyn looked up from her hands, confusion mixing with terror in her expression. "RICO? Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act," Cameron explained, dully, his own understanding of their situation finally crystallizing. "It's designed to prosecute organized crime enterprises. If they can prove we operated as a conspiracy to commit multiple crimes. 20 years minimum," Sarah finished. "Plus civil liability that would bankrupt your families and destroy your parents' careers." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a police siren that made all three students flinch involuntarily. But Sarah wasn't finished with her assessment. "However," she continued, and something in her tone made them look up with desperate hope, "Wing Chun teaches that the goal of conflict is not destruction, but transformation. Not the elimination of opponents, but their conversion into allies." She paced slowly in front of them, her movements carrying the fluid grace that had first revealed her martial arts background. "Master Liu used to say that every person contains the seeds of both their worst and best possible selves. The question is which seeds we choose to water." Brooklyn's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you saying?" Sarah stopped pacing and faced them directly. "I'm saying that you have a choice. You can continue down the path that leads to federal prosecution, civil lawsuits, and the complete destruction of everything your families have built, or you can choose transformation." Marcus's legal instincts made him suspicious of any offer that seemed too generous. "What kind of transformation?" "The kind that begins with full accountability and leads to genuine redemption," Sarah replied. "But it requires something none of you have demonstrated so far: the courage to face the consequences of your actions without trying to minimize, justify, or escape them." She pulled out a second phone, this one displaying what appeared to Be a complex organizational chart. While you've been confessing tonight, I've been coordinating with several other interested parties. Victims' rights advocates, educational reform specialists, juvenile justice counselors, and therapeutic intervention experts. Cameron stared at the phone with growing alarm. You've told other people about this? I've told other people that Riverside Academy has a systematic bullying problem that requires comprehensive intervention, Sarah clarified. The specific details of your involvement remain confidential pending your cooperation with the remediation process. She switched to a different screen showing what appeared to be a detailed timeline. Here's what transformation looks like. First, you'll participate in comprehensive psychological evaluation to understand the root causes of your antisocial behavior patterns, not as punishment, but as diagnosis. Brooklyn looked skeptical. Therapy? Intensive therapeutic intervention with specialists who work specifically with adolescents who have engaged in systematic peer victimization, Sarah explained. Dr. Patricia Hendricks runs a program in Boston that has achieved remarkable success in rehabilitating young people who have committed crimes similar to yours. Marcus's analytical mind was already processing the implications. In exchange for what? Complete cooperation in addressing the damage you've caused, Sarah replied without hesitation. Every victim you've targeted deserves acknowledgement, apology, and where possible, material restitution for the harm you've inflicted. She pulled up another screen showing a detailed spreadsheet that mirrored the organizational tools they had used to track their victims. Daniel Kim will require ongoing psychological support for trauma recovery. Lisa Rodriguez needs educational assistance to rebuild the academic confidence you destroyed. Rebecca Walsh deserves the opportunity to return to an environment where she can thrive without fear. The sophistication of Sarah's planning was becoming clear. This wasn't a spontaneous intervention. It was a comprehensive rehabilitation program designed with the same systematic precision they had used to inflict harm. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah continued, you'll participate in educational reform initiatives designed to prevent future occurrences of systematic peer victimization. Your understanding of manipulation techniques, while applied destructively, represents valuable insight into how these behaviors develop and spread. Cameron frowned. You want us to help other schools identify bullying? I want you to become advocates for the students you once targeted, Sarah clarified. To use your knowledge of psychological manipulation to protect vulnerable students rather than exploit them. The concept was so foreign to their previous worldview that all three students struggled to process it. Brooklyn spoke first, her voice carrying genuine confusion. Why would you trust us to do something like that? Sarah's smile was gentle but carried undertones of absolute steel. Because trust isn't given freely, it's earned through demonstrated commitment to change. And because the alternative is federal prosecution that destroys any possibility of your contributing positively to society. She pulled up a final document on her phone, this one bearing the letterhead of what appeared to be a legal firm. The victims' families have been contacted through intermediaries. They're prepared to pursue both criminal charges and civil remediation. The evidence we've gathered tonight would support their cases completely. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized the name of the law firm, Brennan, Rodriguez and Associates, specialists in victim advocacy with a reputation for pursuing damages that extended across generations of family wealth. However, Sarah continued, they're also prepared to consider alternative justice approaches if they're convinced that genuine transformation is possible. Restorative justice rather than purely punitive measures. Brooklyn looked up with something approaching hope. Restorative justice? A process where offenders take responsibility for their actions and work directly with victims to repair the harm they've caused, Sarah explained. It requires complete honesty about what happened, genuine remorse for the impact of your actions, and sustained commitment to changed behavior. She paused, allowing them to process the magnitude of what she was proposing. But let me be absolutely clear. This isn't a lenient alternative to accountability. It's a more demanding form of accountability that requires you to face your victims directly and spend years proving that your change is real. Cameron was beginning to understand the sophistication of Sarah's approach. You've been planning this intervention for weeks. I've been planning it since my first day at Riverside Academy, Sarah confirmed. The moment I learned about Mrs. Patterson's departure, I knew I was walking into a situation that required more than traditional educational responses. Marcus looked at her with something approaching respect. You came here specifically to stop. I came here to teach, Sarah corrected. But I've learned that sometimes teaching requires intervening in systems that prevent learning from occurring. You three created an environment where education was impossible for your victims. Stopping that wasn't just part of my job. It was the foundation that makes all other teaching possible. She checked the time on her phone. You have 15 minutes to make your choice. Cooperate with comprehensive rehabilitation, including therapy, victim restitution, and ongoing advocacy work, or face the full legal consequences of your documented crimes. Brooklyn spoke first, her voice small but clear. If we choose the rehabilitation program, what happens to our college applications? Our futures? That depends entirely on how committed you are to genuine change, Sarah replied. Several universities have programs specifically designed for students who have overcome serious behavioral problems and demonstrated sustained commitment to positive social impact. Your futures aren't destroyed, but they will be very different from what you originally planned. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his analytical mind processing all the variables. Finally, he spoke. The evidence you've gathered, if we cooperate fully, does it disappear? Sarah's expression hardened slightly. The evidence remains available to ensure compliance with the rehabilitation program. Your cooperation determines whether it's used for transformation or prosecution, but it doesn't simply vanish. Actions have consequences, Marcus. The question is whether those consequences lead to growth or destruction. Cameron looked at his two companions, seeing his own fear and confusion reflected in their faces. We really did destroy people's lives, didn't we? Yes, Sarah said simply. You did. The question now is whether you're going to spend the rest of your lives running from that reality or working to repair it. Brooklyn began crying again, but this time the tears seemed different, less about self-pity and more about genuine recognition of the harm they had caused. I want to fix it. I don't know how, but I want to try. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's the beginning of wisdom. Recognizing that you don't know how to repair damage is the first step toward learning how to do it properly. Marcus looked at the legal documents on Sarah's phone, then at his two co-conspirators who seemed to be moving toward cooperation. His training in legal strategy told him that fighting would only make things worse, but accepting responsibility felt like surrendering everything he'd been raised to protect. If we do this, he said slowly, if we commit to the full program, what guarantees do we have that it will actually lead to redemption rather than just prolonged punishment? Sarah's response was immediate and uncompromising. None. Redemption isn't something that can be guaranteed, Marcus. It's something that has to be earned through sustained commitment to changed behavior, regardless of whether anyone else believes. You deserve it. She paused, allowing the weight of that reality to settle. But I can tell you this. The alternative is certain destruction. Not just legal consequences, but the slow poison of carrying this guilt for the rest of your lives, without ever addressing it. Cameron made the decision that surprised everyone, including himself. I'm in. Whatever the program requires, I'll do it. Brooklyn looked at him with shock, then nodded slowly. Me too. I can't keep living with what we've done. All eyes turned to Marcus, the de facto leader of their group, whose decision would determine whether they faced this together or fractured completely under pressure. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as he wrestled with concepts of accountability and transformation that challenged everything he'd been taught about power and consequence. Finally he spoke. What happens to our parents if we admit to everything? If we go through with this program, how does it affect them? Sarah had been waiting for this question. Your parents will be informed about your participation in therapeutic intervention for behavioral problems. The specific details remain confidential unless you choose to share them. However, they'll also be required to participate in family counseling to address the environmental factors that contributed to your antisocial development. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that this approach protected his father's judicial reputation while still addressing the systemic issues that had created their behavior patterns. All right, he said finally. We'll do it. Sarah smiled then, the first expression of genuine warmth she'd shown since the confrontation began. Then we start tomorrow. Dr. Hendricks has agreed to begin emergency intervention sessions this weekend. The victim notification process begins Monday. And your first restorative justice meeting is scheduled for next Friday. As she powered down the recording app and secured her phone, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from successfully redirecting destructive energy toward positive outcomes. The 3 students standing before her were no longer the confident predators who had tried to intimidate her hours earlier. They were frightened, confused young people beginning to grasp the possibility of genuine transformation. One final thing, Sarah said as they prepared to leave the parking lot. This process will be the hardest thing any of you have ever done. You'll want to quit, to escape back into your old patterns, to convince yourselves that you're victims of excessive punishment. When that happens, and it will happen, remember this moment. Remember to choose growth over destruction. As the 3 students walked slowly toward their cars, Sarah remained in the parking lot for a few more minutes, breathing in the cold autumn air and feeling the centered calm that Wing Chun training had taught her to cultivate. She had used her skills not to destroy opponents, but to create the possibility of their transformation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Hendricks. Emergency intervention team ready. Looking forward to working with them. Sarah smiled and started walking toward her Honda Civic, keys finally secure in her possession. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had proven that even the most systematic cruelty could be redirected toward healing when met with sufficient wisdom, skill, and unwavering commitment to justice. The quiet teacher had not only survived her encounter with Riverside Academy's apex predators, she had transformed them into the beginning of their own salvation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.